As of March 2021, Americans rank the economy, job markets, the handling of the coronavirus, and leadership in Washington as the four most important challenges facing our country. Socialist policies would not alleviate any of these concerns. Countries have tried the socialist experiment. Time and time again, this has failed. Doctors in Cuba moonlight as taxi drivers. Countries with socialized healthcare haven't fared much better than the U.S. in their handling of the coronavirus. And any socialist regime will necessarily involve the bureaucracy of Washington even more heavily in our economy. Any country that has attempted to realize a fully socialist economy has either failed completely, such as in the case of the USSR, destroyed large swaths of their economy, such as in Venezuela, or been forced to embrace more neoliberal economic policies to realize true growth in their economy, such as in China or Vietnam. Liberal market policies work better in both theory and practice when it comes to efficiently allocating resources to maximizing the economic productivity of any country, and we've seen this play out time and time again across a wide variety of markets and countries throughout history across the globe. Oftentimes, people like Richard Wolff will bring up the boom-bust cycle as though it's an inherent flaw of capitalism, but I believe I speak for most when I say that a boom-bust cycle is preferable to just going bust, as so many socialist countries have. Where do you want to start?
Well, can I respond to what was said?
Yeah, whatever you want to do, yeah.
Okay. I find this a laughable caricature of anything I've ever written or anything that I understand is part of this conversation. And I don't appreciate being told what I think or what I say or what I mean or what I intend. I can speak for myself, and that would just be fine if we could allow each other to do that. Number one. Number two, I have no idea what this silly remark that I hear so often is, that no socialist society has succeeded at anything. I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me give you an example. One of the most important metrics used in the economics profession around the world to assess the quote-unquote success of an economic system is the rate of economic growth. You measure GDP and you look at how it grows over time. And then you compare one country to another to assess their relative success, not as societies, because that's a vague generality, but at this particular metric which we use in economics to measure economic growth over time. It's not the only metric, but it's a widely used one. So I'm now going to use it. In the 20th century, the fastest growing metric, the fastest growing GDP in any country measured was the Soviet Union. And in the 21st century we're living in, the fastest growing GDP in the world has been the People's Republic of China. This is not an endorsement of one or another economic system. It's a statement of fact verified by any reliable source of information. The UN, the project in the University of California, Berkeley, and others who keep track of this. So this has to be understood because in much of the world, economic growth is a shared objective and goal that these two societies have excelled at achieving. Number one. Number two, when it comes to socialism, it would be useful if we all understood what the word means rather than playing around with caricatures. For example, the notion that socialism is all about what the government does has been contested throughout the history of socialism. And that idea is less dominant within the socialist tradition now than it ever was over the last 150 years. For example, today, one of the most important issues for socialists has to do not with government regulation, not with government owning and operating businesses, not with these bugaboos of bureaucracy and all the rest of it, but has to do with an objective of transforming the organization of production in a factory, in an office, in a store, not to have a small group of people, the owner, the board of directors, the tiny little minority at the top that is a dictatorial power inside an enterprise, making all the key decisions that the employees have to live with, even though the minority making those decisions is not accountable to those employees. That's a socialism of transformation at the micro level, about which very little could have been discerned in the comments preceding these. If we're going to talk about socialism, then we have to talk about what it means to the people pushing for it and urging it. And those people have learned from the 20th and 21st century, just like those who pushed for capitalism 3 centuries ago learned from their early experiments how to refine, how to adjust, and how to change. To pretend that that didn't happen, to trade in old and shrinking conceptions of socialism may be good debating ploy, but it doesn't advance our understanding of anything.
Okay, if you want, it'd be easier to have a more of a back and forth rather than the super long monologues each, so we can respond to each other more. If you're okay with that, just for a couple of things that you said. So I'm trying not to miss.
I just talk slower than you.
Oh yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. My understanding is that in the 20th century, there was a faster growing economy than the USSR, and it was Japan. Japan still exists today, and the USSR does not. I understand that the USSR did show a huge amount of growth, but I think it's odd to use that as an example when socialists often point to the evils of imperialism, and when you point out the fact that everybody was heavily industrializing around that time as well. I don't think it's fair to say that the USSR simply grew on the merits of socialism when there were so many other things happening at the time, and when it was outgrown by another economy that was...
But those are the facts. I mean, you can play whatever games you want. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union's performance in the 20th century completely outshines that of Japan. There's no comparison. In 1917, when the Soviet Union begins, it is the poorest country in Europe by far. It then goes through 70 years of a lost World War I, of a civil war, of an agricultural collectivization, and of World War II, which did more damage in Russia than in any other country. Notwithstanding that it was the poorest country at the beginning of this horrific story, it ends up in 1965 being the #1 competitor of the United States for global hegemony. That's only because of its #1 status in economic growth that achieved the overcoming of all those horrific losses. I'm not arguing in favor of this or that about the Soviet Union, but the fact of its achievement is a staggering reality that you can dance around from here to tomorrow, but it doesn't go away because it's inconvenient to confront it. And the same thing is true now. If you read Pearl Buck's novels about China before the revolution, you will hear about a society whose depth of poverty literally blows your mind. And here they are about to surpass the United States before the end of this decade. And that was accomplished by a communist revolution and a government that has been run by a communist party to this day. And yeah, for sure, they cleverly opened their society up to capitalists to come and join them. But to imagine that the achievement of the Chinese economy is purely due to the private capitalists rather than to the state economy, that's making believe, because you need to have an argument that puts the success at the credit of one or the other. The infrastructure, the training of the mass of people, everything that happened in China is as much a product of the planning and policies of the communist government than of any other factor. And that has to be recognized as well. And none of this is an endorsement. That society has strengths and weaknesses. It has things we can criticize, but we can't make it up, because it's inconvenient to face the successes they've had and continue to have.
Okay, so I'm not saying that the USSR did not grow a lot. Obviously, the USSR grew massively. Your claim is not that the USSR grew. That's not what we're arguing about. It's whether or not the USSR grew at the rate that it did due to socialism. A country that was heavily involved in multiple famines, a country that heavily went from little industrialization to a lot of industrialization, and a country that engaged in a lot of imperialistic practices is a country that grew massively in the 20th century. To say that all of their growth, or even the majority of their growth, was due to the organization of their economy and not due due to factors that were independent of that organization. To say otherwise, that they wouldn't have grown, maybe at an even faster rate, had they been a capitalist economy, there would have to be some evidence provided for that. And I don't believe that that's ever been adequately demonstrated. On the contrary, I believe some people have argued that Russia could have potentially grown, the USSR could have potentially grown even faster had it abandoned some of its more outdated forms of trying to manage their economy. When we bring up China, China has grown a lot under certain socialist policies for sure. But when we look at China, especially in the 80s and 90s, China began opening itself up to massive growth when it comes to foreign investment. China is the number 2 country in the world that allows for foreign direct investment. And the coalescing of all of China's state-owned, the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, into a select few industries, and then the massive opening of foreign investment into that country to give other people more control over privately owned businesses has been what has caused the massive explosion that we've seen of China in terms of pulling people out of global poverty, as you mentioned in the video that you did for the Gravel Institute. You attribute that to socialist policies, but the thing that really pulled China into the 21st century in terms of economic success was the opening itself up to foreign direct investment, was the opening itself up to other economies being able to interact with them more, which are all neoliberal trade policies. These aren't people-owned businesses. These aren't businesses that are ran by the workers. These are, I mean, if anything, China is a government that runs the business itself. It's a state capitalist economy more so than any type of socialist or communist economy. To say that a single party regime is having the workers themselves making decisions over how any individual business is running, I don't think is fair to say. I guess and then real quick, just finishing.
Your understanding of China. Your understanding of China, though, is really badly flawed.
Can I finish this last? Also, I feel like you didn't respond adequately to because I looked up. No. China has had an explosion of growth in terms of their like GDP per capita. Sure. But when did that growth happen? China, GDP per capita, history. China opened itself up to massive foreign investment in like the 90s. When do we see the explosion of growth, right? It doesn't happen until, I don't know how far back I can get this graph to go, but this is just flatline, sometimes negative, right? It seems like it wasn't until it started to open itself up to massive foreign investment and it started to liberalize its economy more that all of a sudden China saw these massive growths in GDP. That's what I saw, right? Also, I'm not 100% sure on this. I wish my understanding is that Japan's growth was superior to that of Russia or the USSR. I need to go and look that up at some point. You give socialism credit for that, though? Yeah, but it wasn't until they liberalized their economy that, I don't know. The foreign direct investment, the FDI for China has been like a massive driver of its growth. I don't think anybody... He also said that they invested because China had an educated population, even though half the country couldn't read in the 80s. Oh, yeah. And then him trying to say that, like, people went to China because of, like, a cheap labor force. Dude, that almost sounded like a self-own. But I didn't get to push him because he went on for, like, 12 more minutes. He's like, no, that's not true. People actually wanted to come to China because there's a lot of people willing to work for cheap. Like, wait, what? How is this? Are you supporting your argument or mine? You're basically saying that other countries could go to China and exploit their labor force? And that's, like, a big win for China? Oh, yeah, Urk, the trade relationships helped a lot as well when China began to take its foreign trade more seriously, for sure.
I appreciate that, Destiny.
All right, bye. Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.